Dr. Silva, and today I'm going to talk about racing thoughts. Really, what this talk is about is terminology, psychiatric terminology, medicalese, and the communication problems that occur in the context of mental health treatment between patients and their doctors. So that's what I really want to talk about, is how there are terms that are thrown about and they're misused, and they cause a lot of confusion. Now, racing thoughts, I'll tell you about racing thoughts. A lot of times we throw these terms around: mania, panic attack, racing thoughts, and our definitions are off. It's semantics, but semantics are important. So, for example, racing thoughts. So that's just a classic example. Every single time I hear a patient use that phrase, they're referring to anxiety. They're talking about laying in bed at night, eyes wide open. They wake up, they can't go to sleep, and they can't stop thinking about all the things they have to do tomorrow and all the things that happened that day and all of their stressors and their problems and their worries. And racing thoughts is what they call that. But racing thoughts to a psychiatrist indicates mania. Racing thoughts means that your thoughts are racing, that the speed of your thoughts is accelerated because you're experiencing mania. So you're probably talking fast, and you might even be tangential, moving from one thing to another and kind of not finishing your thoughts and exhibiting other signs of psychomotor activation. So racing thoughts means that you are manic, basically. And it could be because you have bipolar disorder, or it could be because you just snorted a bunch of cocaine, but that's what racing thoughts are. However, when patients say racing thoughts, 10 times out of 10, they're talking about, oh, my thoughts are racing because I've got so much on my mind, and it's always my stressors. It's anxiety that they're describing. So I know when I hear a patient say racing thoughts, and also in the context of what they're talking about, they can't sleep or all of their problems or whatever. Plus, a patient who is acutely manic, who's actually having racing thoughts, is not going to come in and say, doctor, my mood is elevated, I'm manic, and I'm having racing thoughts. That would never be a complaint from a patient who's actually having them. It would be something that the clinician would observe, because there would be pressured speech, there would be flight of ideas, there would be signs of a formal thought disorder, and other signs of psychomotor agitation. So the diagnosis could be made, oh, the person's manic, and they're having racing thoughts. It would be something the clinician would write down. But the whole point with that is not to get too technical. I know what patients mean when they say racing thoughts. My point is that there's often a disconnect between the terminology that patients use and what their providers are talking about. In other fields of medicine, when you say you have a headache, when you say that your stomach is burning, or you have constipation, or whatever it is, it's clear we're talking about the same thing. But in psychiatry, because we have these specialized terms, racing thoughts, patients will hear those terms being used and they will adopt them, assuming that it means something they're familiar with, when it's not that. And so probably patients have heard racing thoughts, and they should really never have heard of that term, because as a clinician, I'm not going to ever ask a patient, do you have racing thoughts? Are your thoughts racing? That would not be something that I would ask a patient. That would be like saying, do you have psychomotor agitation? Do you have tangentiality? Do you have a formal thought disorder? That's something that you detect when you do a mental status exam. When you're interacting with a patient who's manic, you note that they have racing thoughts. But at some point, and it's so widespread that patients have been asked, do your thoughts ever race? Do you ever feel like your thoughts are racing? Do you have racing thoughts? And so that's how they're coming to doctors saying, I have racing thoughts. But sometimes patients will come in and they'll use terminology that's not correct, and it won't be detected. So they'll say panic attack, and if the clinician assumes, oh, panic attack, they probably had chest pain and palpitations, trouble breathing, this feeling of impending doom, an urge to flee. But if the doctor doesn't ask, what do you mean by panic attack? The patient, sometimes a patient has described panic attacks to me, and something's off. I always follow up, but especially if something doesn't seem quite right, either with the mental status or the history or the context, or, they're on plenty of Xanax, well, how could they be having panic attacks? And you ask them to describe a panic attack, and what they describe is nowhere near a panic attack. It's not, it's what they're calling a panic attack, and that they just mean they feel overwhelmed, acutely overwhelmed. They're having so much impinging upon them that they don't know what to do for a moment, but it's not a panic attack. It's not even a limited symptom panic attack. A person's pretty agitated and they only last a few minutes at most. Sometimes a person will tell me, I'm having a panic attack. And I ask them, how long does it last? All day. Well, panic attacks don't last all day. They are far too intense. They might last a few minutes. A quarter of an hour, I think, would probably be the longest. The person eventually calms down because eventually they see that they're not having a heart attack, that they're not dying. You just can't be that intensely overwrought with anxiety. They might still be anxious and shaken and post-traumatic for the rest of the day, but panic attacks don't last all day. So when a patient says to me, I'm having a panic attack and it's lasting all day, or 2 days, a 2-day panic attack, they may be cycling in and out of pretty high and intense anxiety during those 48 hours, but they're not having a 2-day long panic attack. So when I hear that, then I especially want them to describe the panic attack to me and what other things. So it's always important in psychiatry to follow up with the patient, to ask the patient to describe the symptoms in lay terms, and especially if they use terminology, jargon, and medicalese. If they use a phrase in psychiatry, you want to make sure that you're talking about the same thing. And so you really want to discourage the use of those terms and instead get just sort of plain English, what's going on. I had trouble breathing and my heart was pounding in my chest and I felt this crushing pain and it was terrible. I was sweating bullets and etc. Sometimes I've heard patients describe a crying jag as a panic attack. Oh, I had a panic attack. What were your symptoms? I was crying and crying, couldn't stop crying. Couldn't catch my breath because I was crying so much. Well, that's a crying jag. That's a crying spell. That's not a panic attack. Another example is that people will often say that they were manic. I hate air quotes, but I'm using them. Manic. And you follow up. They're not bipolar. There's no indication of that. This is the first you've heard of that. And you follow up, and their definition of manic is not. They're talking about mood swings, or they're talking about, which is not mania, or they're talking about anger. A lot of times they're so mad. They were so mad. Or anxiety even. They'll describe different things that are not the agitated, elevated, manic episode. There's another video that you can watch on the overdiagnosis of bipolar disorder that I did that talks about how patients will report symptoms. And if the clinician takes them at face value and just accepts that, okay, you were manic, okay, mania. Now they've documented mania. I've seen that where the patient uses that term and it gets documented. And now you have documentation that the patient has experienced manic episodes. And that's all you need to establish a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. You've already set them up for a bipolar diagnosis. And that's one of the reasons why bipolar disorder is overdiagnosed. Another term that patients use is they say antisocial when they mean asocial or social anxiety. They'll say, I'm very antisocial, or he's very antisocial. And antisocial personality disorder is a specific type of personality disorder in which the person is basically a criminal type, someone who doesn't respect the rights of other people, who doesn't care about violating other people. They have no conscience. So you might imagine a hardened criminal. That's probably the most common example of the antisocial personality. Also, that could lead to a serial killer. That's rare, but the person who really doesn't have any regard for human life or for other people's rights. And they are dangerous, potentially dangerous people. These are people that will not only steal from you, but will rape and murder you and go on about their lives with absolutely no qualms. That's what antisocial is. It's someone who, for whatever reason, genetic, or they were sent to prison for 20 years after an abusive childhood, whatever the reason, they are a menace to society. And they are unscrupulous when it comes to hurting other people. That's not what people mean when they say antisocial. What they mean is that they're not in a social mood, or they have too much anxiety, or they're shy, or they just don't like to be around people. They prefer being alone. So, that's just another example. It doesn't really impact diagnosis because no psychiatrist is going to document antisocial personality disorder when a patient is clearly describing just not wanting to be in a social setting by nature, or even just episodically. It's the clinician's responsibility to make sure that we're using plain English and that we're talking about the same things, and that when a patient uses jargon or uses a phrase, particularly a phrase that comprises a lot of symptoms, like a panic attack, that could comprise a lot of symptoms: chest pain, shortness of breath, palpitations, right? Or a patient will say, I had a manic episode. There's a list this long of potential specific symptoms when you talk about a manic episode. So it's the clinician's responsibility to break that down. Then the patients will use regular words, and then we know we're on the same page. We know we're talking about the same thing. So racing thoughts usually means they're lying in bed and they can't sleep and they're too worried. So you would give a sedative, hypnotic agent, an anxiolytic agent, not a mood stabilizer. It makes a difference in terms of what we're going to prescribe. It's not just academic that we're using these terms, it's semantics, and then, well, I'm going to diagnose this or not diagnose that. It's not just on paper, it does impact what we do. And so when a clinician confuses mania with irritability and anxiety, the agitation that comes from those symptoms, and gives lithium, which is going to be totally worthless and can actually be harmful, instead of Prozac, because they accepted manic episode at face value without delving into it. And the patient maybe describes, mood swings and some difficulty sleeping, and then says manic episode, and then they get treated, diagnosed and treated. Again, the manic individual who's acutely manic is not going to be the one complaining about these symptoms. That person feels good. They have a lot of energy. They're out to conquer the world. It's the family members that are saying, fix my son. There's something wrong with my husband. And manic individuals don't complain of insomnia, right? They don't say, I can't sleep. I'm in bed tossing and turning trying to sleep. Low sleep is a sign of mania. Yeah, but the manic individual isn't trying to sleep. He doesn't want to sleep. He's not in bed tossing and turning. He's up doing stuff. And the family wakes up the next morning and the house is in disarray because the person was up all night doing stuff and being industrious. And so that patient isn't complaining of insomnia. Make sure that you're speaking the same language.